Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK. Now, as we know, the first 100 days of the Trump presidency has been a total whirlwind for comms and public affairs. From the retreat from ESG and DEI to the tariffs crisis and claims on overseas lands, our sector has certainly been kept on its toes, on both sides of the Atlantic, of course, and beyond. So who better to make sense of it all than our guest today, who is a former White House communications director himself. Ben LeBolt was a senior comms figure in two American administrations. He served as an aide to Barack Obama and other senior Democrat politicians and was later director of communications under Joe Biden from 2023 to last year. He's now a president himself, not of a country, but of the policy and strategic comms agency Bully Pulpit International, where he was before working in government comms. For our UK listeners, Bully Pulpit may be best known as the recent buyer of UK agencies Bolt and Seven Hills. Welcome, Ben. Thanks for coming on. How are you today? Hope all's well?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, John. To be clear, I'm an unelected president.
Unelected president. Well, I'm sure there are lots of comments that could be made on the prospect of an unelected president, but we won't go there yet. Let's move on then. So I wanted to kick off with a bit of a reflection really on your time working under these different administrations. What do you see as the biggest differences in working in comms between your time in the Obama administration and later in the Biden administration, would you say?
You know, there was really an incredible difference in how communications has changed and how quickly digital has accelerated that transformation. Certainly, Barack Obama got his rise and was an unlikely candidate to win the presidency in 2008 and did so in many ways by engaging with non-traditional media. It was the time of the rise of Facebook and the rise of Twitter, and we used those tools to get his message out. In some ways, he was the first digital presidential candidate. But we were still adapting to those tools in the White House in 2009 and 2010. You know, it was really the first time the White House had engaged with social media at all, and the press corps was just getting used to it. Flash forward to 2023, when I became communications director for President Biden in the White House, and the world had been completely transformed. In our polling, we found that the number of Americans getting their news from traditional news sources, you know, watching the evening news on a regular basis was about 20 million Americans. Most of them were 65 and older. And if you were a millennial and under, instead of seeking out the news, you really waited for news to hit your feed and information to hit your feed. And there'd been a great transformation in digital in their intervening period in which it had moved largely from a textual discussion on Facebook and Twitter to a world of short form video on YouTube, on TikTok, on Reels. And for Gen Z, the number one source of news was actually on TikTok. So it was a transformed universe. We really had to innovate our strategy and understand that the legacy media was just one piece of the puzzle.
Fascinating. Well, I mean, you know, it seems on one hand a sort of relatively short period, but actually in terms of the development of different types of media, it was sort of a revolution really over that period. And, you know, things continue to change, but in slightly different ways under the current administration. It's really been quite breathtaking what we've seen there from a comms perspective, hasn't it? From the exclusion of journalists with certain titles to really dubious messaging in some areas, such as statements over the deportation of Akilmar Abrego Garcia, which I found astonishing, really. I mean, are you surprised by where we are in terms of the Trump administration's communications policy and approach that we've seen so far?
Well, look, I can't say that I'm surprised because I've probably followed this more closely over the past several years than most people, since they telegraphed what was coming. And they telegraphed what was coming in the first administration when they would shut out certain news outlets for having access to their events when they didn't cover them favorably. You know, we'll see if there are consequences for that. They're in court with the Associated Press right now, for example. I will say the Trump administration has benefited from an owned media ecosystem of creators that lean right more than they lean left in the United States. They're anti-establishment. They were helpful to President Trump during the campaign. Both President Biden, Vice President Harris, and President Trump all engaged with creators, but there's much more reach in that own media ecosystem on the right at this point. And secondly, what I would say is that President Trump is still a product of The Apprentice and of reality television. And in some ways, he has optimized his approach for the current communications era we're in. There's lots of performance art in the room. He's not somebody who cares much about speeches. He really acts things out with cameras in the room in real time, like you saw his interaction with President Zelensky, for example. And that seems to be reaching his base supporters. I will say, gaslighting the truth around some of these circumstances. You mentioned the immigration case of somebody who was deported to El Salvador unlawfully. He had started to alienate independents and persuadables and people who really voted in the election just based on inflation. And for the same reason, a lot of independents around the world voted against incumbent governments over the past several years. And so while he's amping up the base with this approach, he's alienating a lot of those persuadables. And I think that's where you start to see some political consequences.
It's really interesting, this, isn't it? I mean, one of the big discussions in our industry and since the start of the year certainly has been the kind of retreat from ESG and DEI. A lot of high profile corporates that, were found to have done that. And obviously the sort of the edicts from the Trump administration that's forced a lot of them to do so. Do you think there's any sign that perhaps the tides are turning a little bit? You mentioned people drifting away from supporting Trump. Recent opinion polls suggest that's the case as well. And, as we speak, it's the day after the Canadian election where obviously a very anti-Trump sort of mainstream centre-left figure in Carney won the day. Is it too much to read into this as being a retreat from the sort of zeitgeist, if you like, of that swing away from ESG and DEI?
I think you're beginning to see the beginning of a swing against Trump. Look, his approval rating average at this point is down to 42%, which is very low at 100 days into an administration. The American public usually gives presidents about a 9-month grace period after they've entered office. I think the perception is overreach and that President Trump overread what at the end of the day was an election that was decided by 200 to 300,000 battleground votes. If you'd gotten 200 to 300,000 votes in Michigan and in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin that had gone the other way, Vice President Harris would have been president. And instead of focusing on the things that he promised to do, which was get down the cost of living, get down inflation, improve the daily economic life for Americans, he's focused on very aggressive overreach across the government, dismantling programs that people really care about and that impact their communities. So you're seeing his polling sinking in the US. You're seeing university leaders start to speak out for academic freedom. 400 of them signed an open letter this week. You're seeing law firms fight back against executive orders. And you're seeing a global backlash. You certainly saw it in Canada. The Liberals were way down before President Trump became president, before he started to implement the tariffs and threatened to annex Canada. And there will be an election later this week in Australia as well. So we'll be able to monitor for signs of a global response to Trump as well.
That's interesting, isn't it? And you mentioned the sort of right-wing influencer types who have a greater presence in the press area in the White House now, but there's been a bit of a backlash from some of them as well, most notably Joe Rogan. Wasn't he critical quite recently of the detention and deportation approach that the Trump administration is taking? And that strikes me as being quite a moment, because his support of Trump was seen to be one of the most critical kind of turning factors for him in that election race.
I do think it's surprising. While I don't think the erosion of persuadable voters for Trump, who again, I think were one-issue voters on inflation, is surprising because he hasn't responded to their core concerns. But when you start to lose the base of your coalition, that's when you start to get significant political problems, and it could put seats in play in the midterm elections here in the U.S. that had not been in play. Look, the Senate was always going to be tough for us this cycle. The House was going to be a little bit easier. But if he continues, you could see this thermostatic reaction in the polling that starts to bring people back into the Democratic coalition just as a response to Trump. Look, we've got some rebuilding to do as a party ourselves to land on a better economic message, for example, to address people's core concerns about affordability in this country, about housing costs, and a number of other things. But you're starting to see voters driven back into our camp as a response to Trump.
Interesting. And I guess, given our readership of comms professionals, there's always a question in mind: how should the communications industry be reacting to this possible first signs maybe of a shift in zeitgeist? How does this manifest itself in terms of corporate communications? Do you think that maybe there's a sense that the rush to toe the Trump line was perhaps a bit too hasty, and corporate should be a bit more nuanced with their communications around such topics?
Well, look, at BPI, we monitor these trends very closely. And one thing we advise clients is not to overreact to any perceived political moment. We've had a change election in the United States every election cycle, every 2 years since 2006. There's only been one exception to that, when President Obama was elected in 2012. I think at the heart of a lot of this is persistent economic anxiety. There was economic anxiety over globalization and automation, losing our manufacturing base to other countries. Many of our leaders have campaigned on restoring that. I think you're only going to see that accelerated with the adoption of artificial intelligence. And so this moment, I think your core really has to come from your stakeholder universe, your consumers, your investors, the communities you operate in. Do they believe you care about something other than making profit? If it looks like you have no core and the only value set of your company or your executive leadership is making profit, and if you don't understand the changes that are taking place domestically and globally, consumers will quickly start to realize that you're out of touch and hold you responsible for that. So reputation can be connected to the government in power, but we think that too many companies and organizations over-index on that instead of monitoring where their stakeholders are and what they care about, because those stakeholders will be around no matter what government is in power. They're going to stick around 2, 4, 6, 8, 12 years, the lifespan of the company.
It's those companies that don't shift with the political winds, as it were, that have a more resilient reputation in general.
Absolutely. So we just completed an exercise in which we attempted to test a number of misinformation attacks and to try to determine which companies are most resilient in this new environment, which is filled with misinformation. I certainly saw that during my tenure in the White House, but it's also having a material impact on companies, not just their reputations, but literally impacting their businesses and leading to protests. And it could be a piece of information that's totally untrue. So to try to understand how to operate and be resilient in this environment, we conducted a survey of 15,000 adults in the US, the UK, and France, tested nearly 50 attacks against 171 companies to determine which ones were more resilient and which ones were not. And we found that trust and favorability, the historic metrics to judge reputation, only told part of the story. The most resilient brands were perceived to be trusted stewards of change in this turbulent time of global disruption. And across markets, if they believed that the leadership of the companies and the companies themselves had a vision beyond just creating profits for the companies, if they cared about the communities they operated in, if they cared about their stakeholders, if they showed that they were trusted stewards of change, they were much more resilient. So take, for example, a few brands. Nike has done a great job of establishing itself as a trusted steward of change over time, and it showed to be very resilient within our index. PepsiCo, which in some ways is seen as more of an insurgent brand against Coke, less of an incumbent, does a lot of advertising around being a trusted steward of change, did a lot of brand platform work, performance with purpose over the years. Pepsi was seen as a trusted steward of change, more so than Coke. Ford has actually done a great job in the US and the UK of doing so. We'll see with the tariffs and with some of the advertising they're doing around Built in America, if that has an impact on reputation in the UK. We'll see what happens coming out of that. But these are the brands that are able to, if something false is said about them and inserted and put in front of a consumer, they are less likely to believe them because they've established such a resilient brand reputation.
Interesting. It gets to the heart of a lot of the complications that around this industry, and maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but we talk a lot about the difficulties of measurement and measuring the value of PR. And actually, things that you mentioned, like the sort of the reputation of being a stable brand and one that people trust, you don't necessarily see a quarter-on-quarter sales uplift from that. But sometimes in these kind of instances where there is a huge amount of turbulence, then it's that benefit there is really clear, isn't it? So I wonder how the industry sort of ties this into proving its value. It feels like one of those huge industry challenges that I'm not sure we as a sector have really totally got hold of yet. But maybe this is a slight tangent, but I wonder if you had any thoughts on that side of things.
I totally agree with that. And I think there are two pieces to it. One, in the modern communications environment, reputational marketing has to sit alongside communications. It often sits in cooperation with marketing under the chief communications officer. But we see brand reputation be more important than it ever has been before amidst this global disruption and perception of economic anxiety from consumers. I think the second part to this is that there's some segmentation here. So you'll find that some consumers don't care as much about brand reputation. They'll shop at the company regardless based on value or their perception of the product. But there's always a segment of consumers, just like persuadable voters in elections, who really care about reputation and whether or not they want to be associated with the brand. And it does have an impact on their shopping behavior and their sales. And so we've worked with companies and firms over the years, from Walmart to Goldman Sachs, who had these moments where their reputation was really under fire, to help them communicate about all the value that they bring to the stakeholders that they work with and in the communities in which they operate. And it's had a very positive impact on reputation and a material impact on their business.
Interesting. It would be good to go back a little bit. I know you mentioned misinformation, disinformation that has become so rampant in recent years. And I wonder if you get a sense that how much, if at all, but presumably it has, this challenge has kind of deepened under the Trump administration. And how worried are you about it, particularly in the context of AI and what that can do?
Well, I think misinformation and disinformation is a very significant problem. It's impacting governments around the world. It's impacting companies around the world. And I think the initial response to it was to track what misinformation was being said and shared and then try to fact check it through the media. What we found as an agency is that that's not actually impactful, that it's having a material impact on businesses and organizations. And if the attacks are coming online, if they're coming through video and they're having an impact on businesses, you need to not only have a response, a factual response in that environment, but to reassert your brand platform and your value set. You know, we've seen companies lose billions of dollars over accusations that were completely false against the companies. We've seen misinformation and disinformation have potentially tipping point effects in global elections. And we know that some of the misinformation is being shared, without malicious intent, but some's actually being, developed and deployed by foreign governments and foreign actors to try to interfere with elections. You've certainly seen that in Europe play a significant role. I think it will greatly accelerate with AI. I thought that AI would play a very significant role in the 2024 election. I actually think it was premature. I don't think it played a significant role in the 2024 election. I think by 2028, though, it will play a very significant role. And we've got to get our arms around how to deal with it. It will bring great benefits in certain categories, but it also creates risks that need to be thought through now, and we need to grapple with how to respond to it.
It's interesting. We had a similar thing in the UK when there was talk of the general election in 2024 here being dogged by a huge amount of mis and disinformation. It didn't really happen to a great extent. Some people are saying because the outcome was mostly known beforehand anyway, but perhaps it's more of a case that the technology hasn't quite been harnessed as much as some people feared so far, but this may well not be the case in the next few years. We look at how the sort of development in AI has accelerated, and this does seem to be the case. Would you say you're kind of an AI optimist or an AI pessimist overall? Sorry to throw such a broad question on you. It does feel like the right time for it.
Well, look, I think there's great possibility with AI. You look at spaces like healthcare and sequencing genomes and all the sorts of treatments and advances you could see coming to light. Education, personalized learning possibilities for students that will, with the benefit of AI, have incredible curriculum developed just for them that could make a big difference in their lives. When it comes to the information space, it is a tool that can be helpful. I think it's going to be helpful in enhancing creative production in the agency space. For example, it's certainly helpful on the technological front. It's helping us understand who's reading what across the internet, how many views and readers a story's getting versus a piece of video on the internet. We've been working on that at BPI and developed a set of tools around it to help our clients. But when it comes to things like elections or perceptions of what's true and what's not true, that's where we're going to need to be more forward leaning on the regulatory front. For example, if there's a piece of content or an ad in the middle of an election on television or online that was developed and deployed entirely through artificial intelligence, that's the type of thing that should be watermarked, that the viewer should know was developed and deployed through AI. If we just allow AI to be totally unfettered in an environment that's already rampant with misinformation, we're going to run into significant issues. So, that's an area where the Biden administration have been cooperating with both the conservative and Labor governments in the UK. I don't know if the Trump administration is going to do that, but it's going to require responsible leadership, both at a government level and from the tech company perspective, the people who can see the changes that's coming, that understand artificial general intelligence in the moment that, is 5 or so years out, to really work together hand in hand in a proactive way to predict and get ahead of some of these challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crucial. And talking of kind of government communications, but on a more sort of proactive level here, we had an article this week, actually. There's been some talk about, there was someone who used to work in Downing Street comms who made the point that he thinks the UK is always behind the US when it comes to government communications, thinking of areas like use of TikTok and influencer collaborations and things like that. Do you have any sort of views in particular about how you perceive government communications over here versus what it was like in the States?
I worked closely with my British counterparts and my foreign counterparts around the world. I think we were all grappling with the challenge that we weren't seeing traditional media break through in the same way with our populations as we did 10, 20 years ago. So we were trying to determine how to grapple with that. At the White House, for example, we introduced the first director of consumer media that would just talk to consumer media outlets that focused on culture all day and try to insert some of our messaging there with people who are less political. So from what I've seen in the UK in recent weeks from the Prime Minister's new communications director is a pivot to focus on more of those outlets and start to talk more deeply within the creator ecosystem to have more of a digital first approach. I wish them luck on that. That's where communications is centered today. And I think about this as a yes and environment where you still do traditional media, you still sit down for interviews. They're still important, but they're reaching a shrinking share of the population. And so you need to add the consumer and creator ecosystem into that.
Makes sense. Well, you're right. It can never be one or the other at the moment. It's definitely a fragmented environment, isn't it? I think before we go on to your current role in agency side, I thought it would be good to just get a bit more colour maybe on your time working under the Biden administration. Just feels remiss not to ask about what your sort of highlights were, really, from your point of view, and if there's anything in hindsight that you feel maybe you'd have liked to have done a bit differently.
I think we made strides in breaking down the bureaucracy. Walking into a government job, it's different than a campaign. And so the White House was divided between a communications operation and a press operation and a digital operation. And it's easy for that to get too siloed, especially during the pandemic when people were working from home and there was a less of a team environment. So worked closely with my counterparts to break down the walls between all of that and make sure we were running a multi-channel campaign with one message across all those departments, across all those platforms. And for example, the President Biden did 60 interviews last year. 30 of those, about half, were digital first, were creator interviews. And I thought that struck a good balance. I think the challenge, and this was a challenge for every incumbent party around the world, 80% of whom lost elections since the pandemic, was that for all the progress we made moving past a once in a century pandemic, getting to an economic recovery after a severe financial crisis that at a macro level was the strongest economy in the world. What has been a challenge for President Biden and for leaders around the world is the perception of an affordability crisis. This was really the first time, at least in the United States, that consumers had experienced, as a result of the pandemic and a result of the supply chain crisis that came from it, significant inflation for the first time in their lives, certainly if you were under 40. And so even though on paper wages were up, jobs were being created, the economy had recovered, it was growing at a steady pace. On paper, it was stronger than Ronald Reagan's economy in 1984 when he successfully ran for re-election in a Morning in America message. Ultimately, consumer prices just hit people in their lived experience very hard. And it was built on the rising cost of housing, for example, over the past couple of decades and in short supply there. And so I don't think we ended up landing on the perfect message to address that. I'm not sure that any leader in the world has figured out exactly how to respond to that. And I'd recommend moving forward, really centering the message and the agenda around affordability and affordability crisis when it comes to the cost of housing, the cost of goods, the cost of education, recentering on that kitchen table middle class experience for the average person. That's what voters told us they wanted in the last election. That's what President Trump is not addressing right now. And I think an opening for us to really focus on moving forward.
That's interesting. One of the things I think the Labour government over here struggles with is the net zero agenda and trying to communicate that as a good thing in the context of what you say, which is rising prices and a lot of political pressure to abandon some of those. Do you have any views on the best approach to kind of keep those sorts of sustainability initiatives alive, given the challenges?
I think we saw, challenges in communicating that both during the Obama and during the Biden administrations because they took place amidst a severe financial crisis. What we tried to do there was really focus on jobs, on economic growth, and not treat these as some sort of ideological issue, but treat them as pointing out the following, that the largest renewable energy producer in the United States is actually the red conservative state of Texas that produces more wind power, for example, than any other state. We focused on the union jobs that would be created from building electric charging stations across the country so that we could successfully deploy electric vehicles in this country. We talked about the revival of the American auto industry and the need to remain globally competitive there and making sure that we produce electric vehicles here in the United States and not overseas in China, which is certainly benefiting from the Trump administration's actions to roll back some of that progress on the EV front right now. And so by centering on the economic message there, it's a much more powerful way to reach the average person than just talking about the threat of climate change.
Great. So I wanted to go back to your current role now, Bully Pulpit. I mean, could you just tell us briefly, I guess, what your job involves at the moment and what your sort of priorities are for the rest of this year?
Well, absolutely. Look, we are really excited to have some relatively new partners across the UK and continental Europe. We acquired a number of firms over the past couple of years in London and Bolt PPI, which reaches across continental Europe as well, Seven Hills in London, Message House, a series of firms that has capabilities across public affairs, a super strong offering in Brussels and London, across communications, the team at Seven Hills, nobody's better at messaging, and Message House that does research. So part of this will be working closely with our partners in Europe and really integrating what had been at the core of BPI in the United States, which is our technology, things like our Change OS, our operating system, to understand how to communicate and reach people in this fractured media environment where short form video is dominating the internet, and a story in the Wall Street Journal might only get 20,000 reads, but a video online is getting 10x, 20x, 30x those views. How does a company or a leader communicate around that? Another recent acquisition was a Proper Daily firm out of Los Angeles, because one of our findings is that messaging and corporate reputation and politics are really all downstream from culture, that a moment will happen in the culture that then defines a company or defines a leader or defines an organization, and that really centers around the creator ecosystem. So that's where Proper Daily has been really strong, has great partnerships with creators, whether they're celebrities or YouTube stars who might be 22 years old, but have an audience that's bigger than the evening news. And so we can bring, I think, an amazing cultural fluency to our clients as well. And because we come out of a mix of politics and business, I think we really understand this moment of global disruption. We're helping clients navigate it, whether it's shifting alliances, reputational impacts, the changing media ecosystem, the continued perceptions of economic anxiety. We'll be working in a transatlantic fashion to address those challenges with our clients and help them look for new opportunities. But at the end of the day, the center of the business is still figuring out how to communicate in this environment, starting with research, developing a multi-channel communications and marketing campaign that can be deployed across earned media and across digital, and then reacting in real time to how it's perceived and different threats against companies.
Great. And do you think more acquisitions could be on the cards, or more office openings, that sort of thing?
Indeed. I'm sure some future ribbon cuttings to come. I'm heading next week to Berlin, Oslo, and London to 3 of our offices to host public events on the resilience index and this moment of global disruption. And I look forward to more to come.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it, and we're running out of time. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks so much, Ben, for coming on and sharing all your insights, and all the best for the rest of the year at Bully Pulpit.
Fascinating discussion. Thanks so much, John.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you could leave a review, please, wherever you access PRWeek's Beyond the Noise podcast. Until next time, thanks for listening, and goodbye.